Recording has started. So welcome to folks who are listening in via the recording. We simply summarised what we talked about at the face-to-face last week and went through introductions. And now on to the technical issues. So for at the face-to-face last week, this issue came up, or these combination of issues came up, and seemed like there was a lot of interest in them and could be some good discussion. They all seem reasonably related, as they're essentially, how do we partition our objects such that we can be clear about what we're describing, but without making it so complex that the data ends up unusable. So let's start with issue 185, which essentially is, let me share my screen so that people aren't just listening to a flat backdrop. So issue 185 is, should we always partition the artwork part of an object? So, for example, if we want to say that there is a frame, there is a canvas, and then in the middle of the canvas, not necessarily only within the all of the content visible within the frame, should there be a part of the object which is the artwork part, as opposed to support, as opposed to the frame, as opposed to whatever else that we want to talk about. Similar for drawings and other types of objects, you know, that even statues or sculptures rather have a base often that might not be considered as part of the artwork. So.
And Rob, this is Dave. I think so. That's one aspect of it, and then there are also situations where you actually have multiple artworks that are used to compose another piece of art.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, is that differentiated from something like a base or a frame? And I think it is. But I think maybe it's open for discussion.
Mm-hmm. So to continue on that line, because I think it is a very good way of thinking about it. If you had to be more, give a more specific example, I can't think of a real life example of this.
Do you want me to? I actually have a presentation that outlines a bunch of different cases. If
Absolutely.
you want to pull up,
give you the sharing.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let me pull it up here.
Stop sharing.
Let's see. This. Okay, share.
Can you click share?
Yeah. This. I'm looking for the.
While you're looking, here you go.
Can you see?
Yep.
That? Okay, great. All right. So I apologize in advance about when I was writing this years ago, I was kind of confused between recto and verso and obverse, and so just don't pay too much attention to that. But this presentation sort of outlines a concept that we were discussing internally for our website about how should we present these types of relationships that are present in our TMS system. And so it kind of goes through visually and talks about what terminology might be used to describe these relationships, as well as what the actual relationships are. So I'll just try to blitz through here to not use too much time, but if there's any questions, please interrupt. So the first item here is, this coin is categorized as a sculpture, and so it's a physical, what we call cover record for the front.
excuse me, sorry. Is there am I supposed to be able to see something somewhere? Was there somewhere I heard you talk about sharing, and I wanted, is there a way to see what you're doing? This is my first time calling in on this call. I'd like to see what you're referring to.
Yeah, the Zoom client can be used to actually view the screen that's being shared.
Oh, okay. So I need to go to the, okay. So let me, the Zoom teleconference, is that? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Sure.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. Okay.
So this first situation is where you have a physical object and it is linked to a child object, which is, the reverse side, the verso, not the recto. And it has an inseparable relationship because you can't conveniently split the coin without, destroying it. There is an example here of a print where there's a physical cover record, and then so it's similarly modeled to the coin, but it's a print. Then we have here in the Getty, we were talking about virtual objects. So in this case, there's a collection of pages from a sketchbook, and the virtual object is the collection of those child objects. Now it says the relationship is inseparable, so I assume, maybe they're bound somehow together. That's not entirely clear from the data that's here on the in the presentation. You can see kind of like some of the terms here. I don't know if this is going to be helpful or not, but you could say inseparable from and then list the objects that are associated with that. In the case of a virtual record, you might use a term like includes. It's really, these are very vague because the modeling is not by any means an exact science, and there are inconsistencies depending on who has modeled the object in the collection management system. So then we have an example of a portfolio, which is a physical object because there's actually a bound book where the cover is an object, and then the inseparable child objects. There is, in this case, a drawing cover record with multiple inseparable child objects.
And Dave, that looks like one physical side of a piece of something.
Yes, that's a good point, actually, right.
Different bits of art on it. That's
right. So the modeling does not even distinguish between, it doesn't say that these are physically bound together like in a portfolio. So there isn't really any difference between the way this is modeled in TMS and this is modeled in TMS. Yeah. Whether there should be is a different question entirely, but this is the data that we will encounter as we move forward with linked art. And I think, if the objective is to model what we have and possibly supplement with what is missing, but we can sidestep the question of, how to model it, because I think remodeling would be, that's a lot of work. I mean, it could be done, but to not be able to represent the data that we do have would be an impediment to use for sure. Then we have a painting that has a backside to it. This is, I think we've covered that one. Yeah, this is actually, so these are separable. So this is an artwork where you actually have, there's a decorative art. The cover record is, I'm not sure which one it is, whether it's the swan or the candelabra portion of it, but these can actually be, the swan can be removed quite easily, and so that's how they're modeled together.
And the swan is usually the porcelain is first, and then later, and even it exists as an object first, and then actually the mounting is an addition that is sometimes 200 years later, if that is important to have in mind.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That is a particular case for mounted porcelain.
So it was adorned later with.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, interesting.
And it is, you know, then the people who created it might have completely different life dates. So of the two objects.
Right. Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. So it really brings into question what is an art object, right? In this case, we've chosen the left panel here as the the parent object essentially, and then the panels on the middle and the right are the child objects. Similar situation here, I believe. No, this is actually. Oh yeah, so this was a case where this is actually dummied up. So we don't have the whole Maesta, right? This is like a very well-known artwork. We have a couple of panels from it. And I was showing that should we decide to represent that larger artwork in our TMS system, this is what it would look like. And another virtual painting with multiple separable child objects. So there is a virtual record to represent the entire panel, and then each panel is a physical separable child object. And so it kind of goes on. I don't know that we're going to encounter too many different situations than what I've already shown here, but it kind of gives yeah, this one with the stains had like 200 children on it. This was an interesting work here just by the sheer number of child objects assembling the stains. So yeah, so this kind of drives home the fact that object modeling is not necessarily an exact science, and there's a lot of different facets to consider as we move forward representing the data.
Would you mind sharing that presentation with us?
It's actually linked from the notes of the so from here on the 3-4 meeting last week. And if I open up this first link, this is actually from one of our internal wiki systems where I just wanted to put some text around some of these definitions. And so those are both linked. You could read this as well to accompany.
So it's the second one is the slides?
The second one is the slides, right? Yep. Mm-hmm.
Put those two links into today's notes.
And then the actual links to the different use cases I used in the presentation. I think some of these may have changed because I did this presentation probably 4 or 5 years ago. But I imagine a lot of these are still valid. And then there's also some counts by classification, numbers of parent objects, child objects, etc. Just looking at our TMS data in that context.
So first, a question to everyone. Has anyone else done this sort of assessment against, or not even assessment, investigation? Assessment sounds even too quantitative. With their records, and is this something that we might want to have, that we all might want to do to some degree, to see at least if there are interesting objects that we could call out as sort of interesting use cases where there are more than one piece of art or more than one facet of an object that gets described separately in our systems.
Does TMS restrict you from having two sides of the same object? So you were forced basically by the database system to say that the reverse of a coin was a child of the front of the coin?
I'm not entirely sure of whether TM. Yeah, I mean, in that specific case, there are certain fields that are recorded at the object level, and like in the case of a Da Vinci painting, for example, like the Ginevra, right? It's an entirely different painting, and it's really looked at as a separate object. And I think if I don't know if it was all done at the same time or not. I'd have to go to the other object record, but conceivably there could be a completely different set of metadata about that as its own art object. And I suspect that it's that type of limitation that pushed them to model it as two separate objects. I mean, whether it's, I think you could easily make the case that it really is two separate objects, and and that's why they've done it this way and then just linked them together with a parent-child type of relationship. You could certainly have a virtual cover record for the painting, the entire object, and then link the two objects off of that. But as far as TMS, like recording a different title or a different creation date or a different artist for the back versus the front, I don't think that is something that TMS just supports out of the box. But yeah. I'm not a TMS expert.
You might have to create two separate full-fledged TMS records and link them with the see also relationship. It's a little bit different from the parent-child record relationship. But that, see also is kind of a default relationship in TMS, and I'm not sure that's exactly appropriate for this case.
Is the see also the same as what we talked about last week as far as related to, where we had this general notion of objects that were related to each other?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look at TMS again.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Because I know we also have that recorded somehow in TMS. Whether it's but it's a curated type of relationship. Like, this is interesting because this Stieglitz photographic print was created from the same negative as the other one, but we don't have the negative in TMS, so that's how we, relate them together. But it's a curated thing, not an explicitly defined relationship.
I believe that's all recorded in group information, all those types of relationships in TMS.
And Ethan, in chat you mentioned about the coin case. Did you want to?
Yeah, I think this is a case where sometimes your database system restricts the way that you're allowed to model things. So you can model things and input things in a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when you export the linked data on the output, that export has to match the exact way that you input the data. So I think it's fine to use TMS to make a reverse of a coin a child of an obverse, because you're restricted by your own software to do that. But insofar as actually exporting reusable linked data, I wouldn't continue with that sort of rationale.
Yep. Yeah, though of course the underlying system needs to have some field or flag or needs to be some information somewhere for the export to know which of the models to use that isn't exactly what the cataloging system uses. But
right.
Hopefully that's available, or could be inferred from other properties. Like, it's a coin, so we know that perhaps the obverse is always the child, the reverse is always child of the obverse, but then to split that out into a better pattern.
Right, because there are a lot of examples of coins where we don't actually know what technically is the front and what technically is the back. Like, there is no real distinction. There are simply two sides, and we don't know which one you would consider to be the front or the back.
Yep. So thank you, Dave, for the presentation. That was
hello. Am I?
Hi.
Hello.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes. Okay. So I know I'm sort of new coming to this group, and not everyone is exactly familiar with what I've been doing, but what I've been doing for years now has been working on formalizing the informal descriptions of images, of all types of images, but I'm especially interested in art-related images and images from curated from museums and niche collections. And I work primarily with one of my colleagues who has written our lightweight image ontology, is Pat Hayes, who wrote the RDF semantics. And we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this sort of independently outside of the box, since I haven't had the benefit of being able to work in a museum environment per se. But we have spend time thinking about a lot of the things that you're describing, as far as what part of the artwork is not part of the support, and so on and so forth. And I understand you guys have very different systems in-house, and since I had the luxury of being able to build something from scratch that allowed us to just use the linked data, I was primarily concerned originally with wanting to disambiguate what would typically be keywords. So I wanted to be able to use RDF to build relationships from the description, from whatever a keyword might be, to the image itself. To circle back, there's so much that the system does that is what you guys are describing, so I get very excited. But we have worked with a small textile center that collects as a collection of textiles down in Central Florida, and we've worked with their collection of kimonos. They have propaganda kimonos, specifically a large collection of propaganda kimonos, and those have the front and the back. And we have created a way of relating the depicting the item number and then depicting whether or not, and we simply use the linked data description for back, for front and back, and relate that back to the main item itself, if that makes sense. I mean, I could demo this at any time, but I'm not sure that it's appropriate right now in this context of this talk to get into this. But I would, love to illustrate it, because we're doing all of those things, like describing artworks that are related to each other by linking the two items together, by using URIs to link them together in the RDF, and then being able to show how that works with the searching, like how it actually works in terms of inference, and being able to find all these things using the models that you're talking about. So that's all I really wanted to say.
Yeah, I think the issue here, so to go back to, in fact, issue 185, So of course we can partition things. That's sort of a core pattern. The question I think that we should try to, if not answer, at least discuss in particular, specifically, for the next 15 minutes, is whether or not the artwork part should be able to be partitioned.
Yes.
And if it can be partitioned, then should it always be partitioned for consistency reasons? So
well, we use regions. We use regions.
Yeah,
We define them with SVG.
But not so much
Mhm.
at the sort of physical level. So,
Excuse me?
which works in an image, but because you have a segment, a region of the image with coordinates, but not when you don't have that as your baseline, which is the case here. So it pays off. The partitioning will pay off when there are images, because then you can associate the region of the image with the part of the object. Or if in the other issues, should we be able to say this part is both red and chalk, and this part is white and chalk, or green and ink, then we gain a lot, but the complexity potentially becomes quite high in terms of the number of little bits of artwork that we start to have to track. So I think that the easiest or the most compelling of David's slides was the one with the 4, I think they were drawings on the single side of the support, where if we want to both have an object which is that piece of paper or parchment or whatever it was, and the 4 different drawings as different artworks, because they could be done by different people at different times and different places, then that to me says that we must be able to partition out at least a segment, a section, a region of a physical object, as here is a separate artwork, even if it is carried by the same object that carries other bits of art. Also, the front and back, I think we'll get to that one. That's a separate issue. But the multiple on one side is certainly, at least to me, convincing that there needs to be an artwork part possible. Would anyone disagree with that? Would anyone push back on that to say that we don't need to have the ability to separate that out? Okay, that's good. So then the question. So first of all, we need to then be able to say, here is the art part of the thing. But then, so here is the complicated question, and this really comes to usability. So we may want to go off and experiment and come back next time with a bunch of examples to look at. Should we always partition it? So even if the data doesn't really have any information about stuff which is not the artwork, should we always create at least one artwork part of a physical object that then is what shows the visual item of the art? So yeah, for some cases, I wouldn't even like to predict whether it was many or few. This seems like it will be important, but for some cases it will just be additional overhead that we, a boilerplate that people will have to sort of crawl through to figure out what's going on. rather than being important for the particular object. So any thoughts on that?
I think there's also the question of, I guess, where in a hierarchy of objects do we, are some objects more important than others because they are a parent object as opposed to a single drawing that exists on the same side as the parent object, and or should each child object be addressable and just as important as the parent on which it's it lives or is associated.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the other question there is, I know our documentation systems think about hierarchies of objects, but is that concept useful in this environment? We're certainly talking about partitioning, but is it a parent-child relationship, or is it just a containment pattern?
Well, I think in the underlying, in TMS at least, it's a parent-child relationship, but I think it, as we were saying before, it's we don't need to model our linked data representation after the particular terminology that the cataloging system uses, particularly because we have more than one cataloging system across the environment. And if we didn't, and everyone modeled things the same way, we wouldn't be here. So, yeah.
So, excuse me. This is one area where, in doing the work that I've been doing with disambiguating the relationship of the keyword to the image, when we have some distinctions for what is the primary objects in the image and what are sort of secondary there. So I'm beginning to put this together that it's a slightly different model from the parent-child relationship, but I think it would work similarly. When you are talking about this, doing the homework and then coming up with examples for the next call, so would that be appropriate then for me to show some examples of the way that I'm treating this? I think that what's interesting here are the discussions about how to take models that you guys have been working with for many, many years and how they work differently in a linked data environment. I've now heard a couple of examples where some of the things that worked inside of a difference is like this parent-child relationship. So I'm intrigued by what the person who just spoke before me said about do you even have to continue to have those relations, that exact same relationship with linked data? So it's just a question.
Yeah,
but,
I would say that for this particular question, as we can distinguish between artwork parts and non-artwork parts already, and there are ways to have sort of primary things and non-primary things. So I don't think those questions are particularly challenging. I think the question that will be more interesting is the representation of an object where the physical carrier is always separate from the artistic part.
Yes, okay.
Adds value to the structure, or adds complexity, or adds too much complexity in the majority of cases.
Right, so and if the artwork, if every image, if what you're looking at in an image is the whole artwork, or are there artworks contained within it? That is a really interesting question. So for the way that we've treated images as artworks for the purpose of identity on the web, I so this is a very interesting question. Is everything in the image always the artwork, or are there multiple artworks that you're referring to? And right, and the support / frame. Okay, yeah, because we addressed that. So okay, great, thank you.
So yes, does anyone have any thoughts on the sort of consistency versus complexity part of the issue? Because I think that's the big one. We agree that we need to be able to partition the object into art, but should we always do it?
I'll just speak as an art historian. I will say no. Partitioning is a tricky problem. I've been hesitant to chime in just because it's something I would actually have to think about pretty deeply. But it is something though that is common kind of art historical practice, especially in terms of like images that are parts of manuscripts and the like. That's kind of all I can say for now. Sorry.
Rob, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it also seems that the partitioning is important when we have various artworks, right? But not necessarily maybe the partitioning of the artwork and something else. Except, and I'm not sure if that is then what is when the frame is part of the artwork, but still that is a typical part in TMS that is recorded, and sometimes it's still part of the artwork. So I'm not sure if we then, if it is actually easy to make that distinction.
At the NGA, we have some frames that are recorded as objects in their own right, but by and large, the majority are not.
Yeah, I think discussing examples like what David just shared is a good method. I mean, in just listening to this conversation, partitioning makes a lot of sense to me for things that have clear parts like T-sets or, things like that. When you're talking about works on paper and paintings, and for us, we have maybe like 5 frame records in EMU, but really the only way I'd partition out a frame is by some sort of if statement in our dimensions table. If it says this is framed dimensions, that's the only information I could get about that frame as a thing. So that would be a lot of overhead, at least in our situation. We do have a medium and support field that's combined, but we also have a separate medium and support, so that could be an option, but usually just the combined medium and support field, that's all of it together, oil on canvas.
Also, the frame probably would depend on if it's actually an original part of the object or not, or if it was a later addition to it. Because if it was part of the original object, then it is kind of part of the whole. And, that would happen a lot where there would be a particular frame designed specifically for the object.
Yeah, it is.
That's another complication.
It's another complication,
Yeah.
I also think it seems wrong to say that a sketchbook page with 3 drawings from 3 artists is not in itself an artwork. It's made up of other pieces, but I would hate to be the person who decides which assemblies count as an artwork and which assemblies are merely functional objects that contain artwork.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation.
Yeah, I'm almost more interested in how we're able to model the relationships. For example, like the one where it was 3-4 different artworks on a single page, that being able to document that in some way that's not partitioning, but relating the 4 very distinct things that happen to be physically together, that's almost more important than modeling it as a partition when it's not a parts like a T-set and all the different parts of that.
Yep. So here is the issue. So imagine, and I realize I've been looking at the time, so this will probably be something to think about over the next couple of weeks. If you had 2 bits of art on a single page, one was oils and the other one was chalk, then the visual image that is shown, the visual item, doesn't have materials because materials are physical. So without partitioning the physical thing, you can't say that one is made of chalk and the other one is made of oil paint. So if that is a use case, and I would be surprised if it wasn't, then we would still need to partition the physical thing as well as having different visual items shown. Equally, if you have dimensions, dimensions are also physical. So you would thus also need to have the physical partition of, here is the physical carrier and it is this wide, and it is made, the physical image, if you wish, is made of these different materials. So yes, we could say there is one physical thing and it shows 4 separate visual things, but then you couldn't say anything about the physicality of the image, only what it depicts or what it represents. Well, it is the top of the hour. So homework-wise, if we can go back to our collections and find interesting use cases, if it's easy, even having a sense of how many of these use cases exist would be valuable, because this is only sort of 0.5%. Well, maybe we don't need to manage it so carefully. If it's 10% or 20%, maybe we need to pay more attention. I realize that particularly in some systems, that's quite a difficult thing to figure out. So I don't want to make undue work, but if it is easy, it would be very valuable.
Sorry, Rob, can I just say the use case being precisely?
The cases when there are multiple things that we consider an artwork, which are part of the same physical thing. So the sides of a coin, the sides of a manuscript page or a panel, multiple paintings or artworks on a single side, and that kind of thing. Triptychs.
Okay, sure.
Etc.
Okay.
So
and we can prepare these for the next meeting to show these use cases.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay.
So just to make sure I got this, any numbers we can have, like percentages of our collections that are that, but then if there's any specific unique examples, to pull the raw data and share that? Okay,
yep.
Great.
That would be perfect.
Yeah.
Great, thank you everyone. I'll post the recording and put some notes into the issues, and we'll talk again in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.